I want to thank the 4 people coming up here or are up here already for this next session. We have Trish Collison, who's team leader, Indigenous patient and family experience at BC Children's and Women's Hospital and Health Center. We have Darci Rosalie, sorry, that might be me, Indigenous cultural safety educator for Perinatal BC and Women's Hospital. Kat Broad, who is a social work clinician, multi-organ transplant clinic at BC Children's, and Jordan Hermiston, who's a program facilitator and family services with us in BC Transplant. So I'll let Jordy take it away and introduce what you're going to talk about and carry on.
Cool. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Sean. Thanks to my colleagues that are joining me up here today for our conversation. I think we should just get started, and we are going to go through kind of our own introductions. So I'll start, and again, my name is Jordy Hermiston. I'm here as the program facilitator for family services at BC Transplant. My professional background is as a social worker, coming to BC Transplant from the intensive care unit and the emergency department at Surrey Memorial, St. Paul's, and I've worked a bit at VGH here as well. I am a settler, of course, on this land. 4 generations back, my family came to Canada, mostly from Germany, and also have a Doukhobor heritage, who the Doukhobors were Russian pacifists that settled in the Kootenays when they were driven out of their territory in Russia. So maybe pass it to Trish.
Thanks, Jordy. My name is Trish Collison. I am of Haida, Welsh, and Irish American descent. And I am the team lead for Indigenous patient and family experience with the Indigenous health team. And I've not been in the role for quite a long time, for a couple of years. I've been in this team lead role for about 4 or 5 months or so. And by background, my first career was in forensic anthropology and museum studies. So I've worked in New York and Washington, DC, and Seattle. And then I made the transition into healthcare and became an LPN in America, in Seattle, Washington, and kind of catapulted me into healthcare and in this field, and it's been incredibly rewarding, and I've learned so much from all of my colleagues and all of you. Yeah, anybody who I've ever had to work with on any cases that we've worked with together. And I hope to continue building those relationships, and I look forward to connecting with all of you at some point. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kat Broad. I'm a social worker at BC Children's and Women's. I have the delight of working in the multi-organ transplant program for many years now. But my background is actually, I've come out from Australia, so I'm a real privilege to be able to live and work and play here. I actually come from a place traditionally called Burloo Wudja, which is in Perth in Western Australia. And I practiced as a social worker there, working with some of my lovely Indigenous families there, and then moved out here in pediatrics ever since. And so I have myself and my husband and my 2 girls have the delight of being dual citizens across Canada and Australia. And as I said, have a great privilege and pleasure to be able to do this work alongside some pretty remarkable people and the patients that we serve.
Thanks, everyone. I am Darci Rosalie and identify as a white settler. My ancestry is mostly mixed European, England, Wales, Poland, Ukraine. So quite a mix there. My parents and their parents, so it's third generation, were not invited here to these lands, these unceded and traditional Coast Salish lands. Specifically, they're growing up on the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, and then moved to Calgary, where I was born on the territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, and lived there a little while, and then came back to Coast Salish lands and raised up in the valley, Stolo Nation, nations, lands, most near Kwantlen, actually. And yeah, I am a nurse. I trained as a perinatal nurse, and I've been working at Children's and Women's for 15 years now. So yeah, I really love Children's and Women's as a workplace, and really love the work that we're doing there too. As well, I know Trish from being on the Indigenous health team together. I've been on that team for about 6 years, and know Kat from working together with some of the families that we served in the multi-organ transplant team. And I just met Jordi, like really, in preparation for coming to talk to all of you today. I really do take my responsibility as a settler, as an uninvited guest, to understand these protocols of the lands, to understand my responsibility to uphold the rights of Indigenous peoples. So yeah, just really happy to be here, happy to talk about relationship and everyday talk. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, so I think we're gonna go into what is kind of informing our conversation today and framing our conversation today is this idea of the kitchen table dialogue that we've encountered. Darci kind of brought it to us, but for your own reference, there's dialogue guides on with Reconciliation Canada. So you can do your own kind of research into what this dialogue is all about, or this framework is all about, but I'll let Darci kind of introduce the idea.
Yeah, so when Kat and Jordi came to me and Trish and wanted to talk about how we best serve Indigenous families in the care that we provide, we got together and we just started chatting. Like we were really talking about what we noticed, what was working, what was not working. And the more and more we got into these really like in-depth conversations that were casual, comfortable, and also very like pointed as well. Like we were certainly at the level where we could speak about, some of the underlying anti-racism and critical race theory like within it. And it just reminded me of the kitchen table dialogue guide that the Truth and Reconciliation Canada put out on their website. And I was like, this is exactly it. These are the type of conversations that we need to be having. And when I first came into Indigenous health 6 years ago, I found this and I was like, oh, this is amazing. Like we're going to be able to like have these conversations and just go for it. And, I think it was a bit ambitious for that time. And it's, I'm laughing because it's not funny, but at the same time, we, talking with our team, getting something going where these are hard conversations and talking about race, talking about racism, talking about the system the way it is. It takes time for people to understand where they are, in that process. And for me too, like my colleagues were so generous in helping me come along too, and seeing how as me as a white settler can use my positionality to really name things and shine the light on it and talk, have the dialogue. And so fast forward 4 years later, my boss at the time where we were having some of those conversations forwarded me this article by Ellen Cole and Priscilla McCutcheon. And it's based in the Department of Geography, but they really do a good job of talking about that importance of everyday talk, coming together. who are you speaking with? Who is at your kitchen table? Like what type of conversations are coming up, and how are you guiding, those conversations? Is there anybody missing any perspectives, that, from the people who you speak with on a regular basis? Are there missing perspectives that you're not necessarily getting to kind of hear or interact or understand? So yeah, we thought that this would be, and I have to say, every time we got together, it was like a full on, we got together probably like 4 times, and each one was a very rich dialogue. And so, yeah, that's kind of where it started from.
So I'm wondering, I guess in our conversations in the past, or this idea of a kitchen table dialogue or a more casual conversation about our challenges or our successes when we're thinking about supporting Indigenous patients and families, or any patients and families. How do you see this more kind of casual conversation working in our practice, and what's the benefit, or what has been the benefit for you guys?
I think one of the greatest accomplishments that we see is, and I've been preaching this, I think, since I began this job, is to improve health outcomes for Indigenous patients. And when that doesn't happen, we do have the opportunity to kind of step in and just make it right with, right that relationship with Indigenous patients. And I know it has been problematic in the past. Why do we focus on anti-Indigenous racism specifically? Why are we not grouped in with everyone else? And the only answer that I have to that is that with anti-Indigenous racism, it's very specific. The stereotypes are very specific, only to Indigenous patients. The assumptions made are specific only to Indigenous patients. And just for example, if you have someone who doesn't know anything about Indigenous people, who've never had a conversation with them, but they listen to the societal norms and the racist assumptions and the discriminatory language, whether consciously or unconsciously, it's there. And so if you have a patient, for example, who comes in, their gait is off and their speech is slurred, where does that person go? What assumption, what conclusion does that person come to without even making a proper assessment? And I could tell you where that goes, but I think I will leave that there, because it does, when people do make those assumptions and people do jump to those conclusions without even having a conversation with that patient, it affects the health outcomes systemically. It has been right from smallpox up into the TB sanatoriums in the 60s, when they were throwing in healthy children into these TB sanatoriums with the end game of basically wiping us all out. And unfortunately, we survived that. But now our patients at Women's and Children's Hospital are now the grandchildren of the survivors of those sanatoriums, who may or may not have passed on that intergenerational trauma of mistrust of the healthcare system, because medical experiments were also done at those TB sanatoriums. Forced sterilization was performed at these sanatoriums. So, and I'm not talking like 100 years ago, I'm talking the 1960s, 1970s. So this is a very much a today problem, very much a tomorrow problem. So and ultimately, you know, when we don't know, obviously, we don't know what kind of patients we're coming, like that we encounter every day. We don't know their history. We don't know if they've had a horrific experience. All we want to do is give them the best care that we can give. That, and I'm not, and it's something that I've always maintained, that we don't want Indigenous patients to be treated better than everybody else. We just want to be at par with everybody else. There is that disparity because of those assumptions and because of those conclusions drawn unnecessarily. It does affect the health outcome. And so if we can build healthy relationships, you know, with healthcare professionals, the word gets around, you know, when they go home. I hope that they can go home and say that BC Women's and Children's Hospital is a safe place to go. You can go there, you'll be treated with respect, with kindness, and that is ultimately why, you know, why I get out of bed every day, why our team gets out of bed every day. And we just want to, you know, make the best experience for patients, our little patients moving forward, and normalize that healthy relationship with those little kids where, you know, they don't have to recover from the trauma of their healthcare experience. And ultimately, that's where our team would like to go. And we have found the blessing of Kat, who also has that same vision and also has that same heart, and Katie. And so, you know, and those relationships that we built to get to that goal has been it's been an incredible experience.
Thanks, Trish. I could not speak more highly of Trish and her contribution to the transplant program, along with Darci. As a social worker, the biggest challenges are to try and advocate for our patients across the board, to be able to make sure their voices are heard, but especially, as you can appreciate based on what Trish is describing, but what you already know is just how much more important that work is. So in the context of transplant and what we've talked about, you know, this is things like helping teams to have curious conversations about some of their assessments that they're making of patients. So things like, just to give very pragmatic examples, if an Indigenous patient doesn't come to their appointment, being very careful about how we talk about that, because if we write that they're a no-show, that has greater context. That's just a very simple example. And so when I've drawn on Darci and Trish as Indigenous health colleagues, I draw them in to help me to be able to provide a greater light on these conversations, to help have another voice at the table. And I know that, unfortunately, the other challenge that comes with is that I put them in this really hard position where, and I think we just need to be really mindful of this, particularly as a white settler, whenever I'm bringing an Indigenous voice to the table as an Indigenous health colleague, that how that lands for people there's still area for growth, because I think we need to be really mindful that we're putting a lot of pressure. And I say this to Trish every time that we meet, that I'm inviting you in, but I recognize that puts you in a place where everyone's going to expect that you're going to say the thing that's going to be the most important. We have to follow it verbatim. Whereas we might all be saying the same thing as what Trish has been saying the entire time. But when she comes into the room, there's this real pressured position that we're putting her in. So being mindful of positionality has been one of the other big challenges that I've certainly faced as a social worker on the team. And then trying to bring along everyone to see that they have as much of an opportunity to be able to have these curious discussions as anyone else is I think the continued work that we can do.
Yes, definitely. Thank you both. To continue on that note, to be able to have those curious conversations, we really have to do the work ahead of time. So doing the work of understanding how to speak to anti-Indigenous racism, the systemic racism before you're sitting in front of your patient. So doing whatever you need to know how to position yourself, to know how to speak to which lands you're on, to know how to speak to the history that we were all programmed with, and then the history that is true for Indigenous peoples and the history that we all share together. So patients can tell. They can tell if you've done the work, done your homework, in terms of knowing, how to be in respectful relationship with the land, with the people, and those ways of understanding and getting, some of those socialized stereotypes and biases checked can really lend themselves so well to those curious conversations, because then we're all ready for those and we can have them in a really respectful way, because we're all colleagues here too, so we want to have those conversations in a good way, in a nice collegial fashion, of course, and just get to where the reason why we're all here, which is to give really good care and to be supportive in someone's healthcare journey. And I know for a lot of the what I've experienced with working with the transplant team is those relationships last a really long time. There's like it's not an in and out, kind of healthcare encounter. And so you have more there to work with in terms of the longer relationship. And that might be something to consider, like around, how those relationships are held.
As we've kind of talked about this idea of like knowing history, doing our homework, knowing our kind of positionality as settlers in this work, I'm curious about, like, I don't want to do my homework and then approach an Indigenous family or patient and be like, so I understand residential schools, I've done my homework. Like, this question of like cultural safety comes to my mind, and I wonder if you guys wouldn't mind speaking to, like, what does culturally safe work, or what does a culturally safe environment look and feel like?
Ultimately, again, I think I just want to go back to normalizing and making a healthy environment for Indigenous patients. And so for example, like I've brought into a case where there was a Zoom call with the family, with the transplant family, and there were comments made like, I was really surprised at how clean their house was, or I was really surprised at how educated the mom was and how well she spoke to how much she knew about her son's medication. So in answer to your question, I would say, don't do that. Just don't do that. Don't make those assumptions, and rid yourself of what you think you have heard about Indigenous people, and just be, come in with kindness and be yourself, and make it and normalize that healthy relationship of building that relationship with Indigenous families, and rid yourself of the assumptions and really the lies that you've heard about Indigenous people. And if you can, really come in with kindness and curiosity, you're going to get off with the right foot, and you're ultimately comments like that, it does impact the ultimate health outcome of that patient, because if they get wind of how they're being spoken about, they're not going to come back. And I've seen that happen. And so we get brought in to write that relationship, to make that a safe place for them again. And so ultimately, I think really just normalizing that healthy relationship building that you would with anybody, any patient. Just don't do that. Don't make those, don't jump to those conclusions before you even have that conversation. And just, be kind and be generous with a listening ear. And because sometimes it takes time. We have had a family that Kat brought me into. They were very quiet, both the mom and the patient, and were very, very shut down. And ultimately, it took time to build that relationship. And in my role, I had that capacity to do that. And that ultimately, that relationship building is so key to how far that patient is going to go in the health journey. If anybody takes time to get to know you, that's a big deal. You feel validated, you feel heard. And in a healthcare setting, that's key. That's really, ultimately, that's why they come. They need help. They want help. And if you can afford the time to just be a listening ear and to be kind, it's everything. And that's truly, I am veering off the textbook definition of what cultural safety is, but ultimately, that's what it is to me.
Thank you, Trish. Yeah, that is how my experience has been as well, is that place of safety within relationship. And cultural safety, from my perspective, like as a settler in this work, a lot of it is really addressing the anti-racism part of things. And part of that is understanding how I'm coming off and, my intention versus the impact that's on, the person in front of me. So I might be like a sort of like bubbly, kind of validating sort of presence in all of my life, but I need to be aware that the stereotypes and the types of discrimination that are out there, where if I'm acting like very enthusiastic about like, wow, that's so amazing that you were able to do that thing, like that could come off, that could land in a way that I don't intend, but it doesn't make a difference that I need to know how it's going to land. I need to know what those like stereotypes are, and I need to make sure that I'm addressing them within my own positionality so that I alter the way that I am, because it doesn't matter what my intention is. It matters what the impact is, to that family and how they're hearing me. And so that's part of the responsibility around creating safety is knowing, how to navigate those conversations and how to do them in a very respectful way. Yeah.
I think, Darci, just on that note, it kind of harkens back to what Trish was saying about that experience that she had where the healthcare provider was surprised that the mom knew so much or was so like well educated about her son's healthcare. And it's like, the question is for yourself, like, why are you surprised? How are you entering into that relationship, and how are you entering into that interaction that results in you feeling surprised that it didn't go a way that you expected? And maybe as well with your example of like, am I being overly excited than would be normal for me because of who I'm speaking to?
And I think certainly for me, what I've tried to work on instilling in our multi-organ transplant program is an opportunity or a culture within our team I keep striving towards, where we can maintain curiosity even when we do make assumptions. and because it will happen. We are positioned, as we've talked about quite openly, as predominantly white settlers. And so, for example, when this came up, being able to create a culture amongst your teams where you can actually say, with curiosity, why was it surprising? Because what often, if you name it in the moment, what I've learned, certainly like my direct Australianisms of like, why do you think this is, surprising, doesn't land necessarily well in a big team kind of meeting. So actually being able to provide structures and systems where you can have those conversations without promoting kind of a defensive response, I think is key to cultural safety. So it means being intentional as whatever teams you're working on about where we have these conversations that promotes ongoing growth, learning, and development, with a real sense of openness. So the kitchen table dialogue is, I think, a really good way to do that, where you intentionally say we're all coming to a table together, equal players in learning with curiosity, open hearts, open minds, so that you can at least acknowledge what these assumptions will come up because we are embedded in a history that just will continue to live its way out until we have conversations and hold each other accountable. So for me, cultural safety continues to look like coming in to see a patient and being extremely curious about what their goals are for care, what they think is most important, and how we as healthcare providers can best support them to achieve that.
I mean, I like what you said there. Like, you're speaking to, in the context of how you operate within your team, cultural safety maybe looks like vulnerability and like a willingness as a team to acknowledge that mistakes will happen. We as collectively don't know all of the answers. We don't know everyone's experience. And so how do we acknowledge missteps and learn from them?
And that we have a responsibility, not just when we call on Indigenous health to come into those discussions, that this is something that we all are committed to. And I think that's the difference, and where the transition's starting to see changes is that certainly in my earlier parts of social work, it felt like we were using Indigenous health only when an Indigenous person actually asked to see an Indigenous liaison officer at the time. And now we're seeing that actually we're using Indigenous health services to be able to embed greater, like a culture of accountability, a culture of learning. And that's what I think we need to kind of take away from, the conversations that we're having today, but many others, is that this is actually about this ongoing commitment as a cohort of healthcare providers wanting to do the best for our patients.
I have a question that I'm interested in, again, all of your thoughts on. In your various roles, working like individually and together, what enables you to do what you would consider like your best work?
Definitely. Ultimately, honestly, I get really selfish. I have this 4-year-old niece who has gone through so many health complications right from birth. And I see her quite frequently when she comes for appointments at Children's Hospital. And her experience 100% of the time has been incredible and safe and fun. And I don't think I've ever seen anyone get so jacked up about going to a dentist appointment and having that relationship with an anesthesiologist. Never seen that before. In the very short stint that I've had in healthcare at St. Paul's, in long-term care and in hospice care, and in Seattle's version of the downtown East Side population, I've never seen a staff so passionate and so engaging. If you ever want to see a healthy environment of work, environment, I would definitely just roam any floor at Children's Hospital, and you'll see how many people love their job. And it's so amazing, and it's so incredible to see. And ultimately, when you see a happy kid roaming the halls at Children's Hospital, like, nobody wants to be in a hospital, nobody. But if you see them happy, you see them engaging, that's a really good sign that they're getting safe care for me. That's what I see when I see that. The fact that they even want to return for multiple visits is incredible. And that's the most rewarding for me. And to ultimately see, like, this is what we're striving for. This is what we want for Indigenous patients also. And if that happens, that's like the best outcome that I've ever wanted. And when I first started my job as a discharge liaison, when I told my family I got this job, I was not even aware of my dad's experience when he was discriminated against with his doctor. I was unaware of my uncle, who was a pastor for 40 years. He was asked 6 times, when was the last time you had a drink? All of these stories kind of came flooding out of them when I told them I got this job. And I had no idea. They never spoke of it. They never mentioned it. And so I hope, like, my end game is that, my little niece Kaylani won't have those stories to tell. When she's older, that she'll have, healthier stories to tell. And when that happens, it's a beautiful thing. And when it doesn't, we do our best to make it right and write that path again with staff and with patients. And I've said this in many times, I think, when I've spoken with staff, like, our intention is never to derail anyone's career, when things go off the rails. We want to build a healthy relationship with the hospital staff too. And we are doing that. We are doing that really well, I think. And we're not there to slap anyone's wrist, when things go off the rails. That's not who we are, and it's not what we want to do. What we want to do is build that dialogue and just make people aware that this is how it lands. Maybe it's not appropriate. And if we can, and the relationship building piece for me, ultimately too, within the staff, I have made so many amazing connections who have helped our Indigenous patients for the best health outcomes. So for me, I think this is the healthiest work environment I've ever had the pleasure of working in. And it's not, and working in healthcare, you must know it's not always the case. And so, long story longer, I think, my most rewarding, I'll bring it back to, to the kids that wander the halls. When you see them happy and engaging, that's a good thing, because it means that we are doing our job.
Thanks, Trish. I feel like I can't really beat that by any stretch, but I would say that my partnerships is really big for me. So when it comes to doing this work, I think I'm doing my best work when I have the people that are willing to join, with me in that work. So when I've been able to work alongside, these guys, but so many others, and feel like we're working towards the same goals of trying to improve patient care, and listen. I think kind of going along your point, Trish, of like seeing the patients in the whole, like, ultimately for me, the best part of our work is when we can really, when I, as a social worker, I'm sitting down with a patient and I can really listen, with a really, like a deep listening to what matters to them, and be able to hold space for what matters to them, even if it's not exactly what matters to the healthcare team or the doctor that's about to see them next. But when we can actually hear that and make space for it in their care and be able to find a way in which that stays throughout their healthcare journey. And as we indicate, like the transplant patients, this is a long journey. So if we can hold space for whatever that is, and see that as part of the conversation around their health, I think that's when I certainly do my best work in conjunction with everyone as a team.
Yeah, I've witnessed both of those best works. Thank you to both of you. Yeah, I feel like I'm doing my best work when I'm kind of in the flow of conversations and collaboration, and I'm in that place of non-judgment. That open heart, open mind, wax hooks and swallowing is one of the teachings. Actually, I have these paddles in my pocket. I'm gonna see if I can take them out. But yeah, Sulkson, who's a knowledge keeper from this Musqueam nation, has gifted all of us with the 6 Coast Salish teachings. And I carry around these paddles to really remind myself, what I'm accountable for. And I use them very, very regularly. And that's what they're intended for. They're intended for us to bring these teachings, these Coast Salish teachings that are sacred teachings and have been gifted, to bring that into each and every one of our work, so that we can use it as a touchstone, a touch point to do our best to be together as one, not so much. And I'm going through each one and just seeing how each of them resonate with me more and more. And I feel like when I can combine, my own belief and values and really see how that aligns with these beautiful teachings, that's just a really good feeling.
Well, I wonder if you just keep the mic there for a second, Darci. Like you were saying, you've been in your role for 6 years or so now. I wonder if you have noticed or what your experience of shift has been from when you started your role to your work now.
Thanks, Jordy. Yeah, it's been a massive shift. From the days of just meeting Kat, I was very new in my role. The role was more centered around community liaison, so really assisting patients back and forth to Children's Hospital, getting to know the families really, really directly. And at that time, it was really hard because we couldn't say racism in the clinical setting, and that was only 6 years ago. I felt like I couldn't. People were like, "What are you here for?" I'm like, yeah. So over time, and in particular, one of those defining moments that I really felt palpably really came from the work. And again, the work for Sulkson's teachings have come from the PHSA Indigenous Health. So they're up there just doing so much great work with leadership. And they also, the Sanyas team. And for those of you who haven't done Sanyas, I highly, highly recommend, and becoming more and more mandatory, to have that base of knowledge. But during that time, the In Plain Sight report came out and made it very, very specific within a BC context of where this the racism was living within our healthcare system. And that's when things started to really, really start to open up. I had way more of those informal, everyday talk in the hallway, in the cafeteria. "Oh, Darci, can I meet you for a coffee? Oh, let's go. Hey, do you have a second?" After a meeting, like those type of things where those dialogues, and we can say like the everyday dialogue or the kitchen table reflexivity, we're starting to come more and more to our team and to my in front of me in particular. And people could ask me, some of those awkward questions that wouldn't be the appropriate questions to ask our Indigenous colleagues, to put those questions on them. But as a white settler in this work, those questions I want to receive, because then we can have, a dialogue. We can start to have those more meaningful conversations.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I feel like I'm split between two contexts a little bit, coming from Australia and here, and there's parallels and differences, but certainly I'm going to speak just to the progress here, that I think that there was a real shift when the In Plain Sight report came out, and I would identify that as a social worker as a time where truly, I think more and more we were feeling a responsibility to do something different and to really think critically about how that could feel. I'm sure there's going to be an announcement.
Joseph Baxay, return to level 3 PCU. Joseph Baxay, return to level 3 PCU. Joseph Baxay, return to PCU level 3.
The other thing that I would say is that I want to project forward in terms of where I hope the progress could be. So I think right now we are, like Darci saying, we're able to have more conversations amongst ourselves and with colleagues, but typically we're seeking out still the colleagues that we know share mostly the same view as our own. And so what I would love to see going forward is actually these conversations being put to teams as important as your rounds discussion about patients, as important as your QA meetings, that we actually are joining together and all intentionally making a commitment to having these dialogues, not just in an elevator, not just at a cafeteria. I mean, they can still occur there. That's not to say they can't, but to be able to make sure they're as critical to care going forward. And that's where I'm hoping things progress to. So I feel like we're now having more and more talks about what we're seeing and what we're observing with some confidence, but typically with the people that we know probably share or are seeing the same things as us. And what I encourage you all, I'm hoping you can walk away from this today to think about how you can actually draw other people into that conversation with intention so that we can keep this work going forward. That's certainly what I'm hoping for progress going forward.
In the very short time that I've been here, I think really the shift I've seen truly is from the top down, like from David Byers. Has been just such a game changer for me. And I think, with leadership like that, it really makes it easy to build a healthy relationship and build a healthy environment within the hospital because of his leadership. And I was just really blown away by, when the first 215 students who were discovered in Kamloops a couple of years ago, maybe almost 3 years ago now, it didn't go unnoticed. And the response was immediate. And at first I thought, oh man, he's got a really good writer and they're very on top of things. But a colleague of mine is a friend of his, a personal friend of his, and she said, no, that's him. What you see, those are his words, those are his thoughts. And I was really blown away and really have so much respect for him and the leadership that he has shown by example. And recently he also publicly had made a statement about the conflict in Israel and Palestine. So this is a guy who truly cares and humanizes patients, has the ability to humanize human beings, which is, in a clinical setting, in a healthcare setting, that's sometimes I think that gets lost. And so for me, I think I've seen that shift happen in the most positive way because of his leadership.
And when it's like permission giving in a way that we're all encouraged and invited to have these conversations openly, be vulnerable openly, connect with people and learn from each other openly, I guess. Cool. I'm conscious of the time, so I just want to maybe proceed to thinking about closing. And I hope that our conversation has landed in a good place with our audience. And I want to just ask our audience for a moment to just kind of be a bit reflexive and think about maybe there's one thing in our conversation that sparked something in your practice or your experience, and want to just take a minute to reflect on that privately. And maybe ask yourselves kind of what you might take away from the dialogue. What feelings, if any, did it bring up for you, and maybe where those feelings are in your bodies, and where, if thinking critically about our own practice, like where is there room for us to expand or grow in our work with Indigenous patients and families, or our work with each other, and what can you do also to remain open and inclusive in your work? And I would invite us as well to reflect on again the Coast Salish teachings that we've been gifted as an organization, and Darci referred to them. And I think when we were having these conversations leading up to this, we really saw this kitchen table framework as an interesting way to not just read the teachings, but actually to integrate them into our practice through conversation with colleagues, and do the real work of letting them guide our decision making, our practice. So I'd encourage everyone to check it out, check out the framework, and practice talking. Really, it's all practice, isn't it? And just some ideas for resources. And we could open up to some questions for the last few minutes, or comments or anything, reflections on your own practice.
I have a question. Hi there. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. With BC Transplant, we support a lot of the frontline work, but myself personally, and others, leaders in our team and people I interact with, really try to deal with the policy side of things. And so my question to you is, how did you go about building trust within your circle of work? Because I feel that that's probably one of the key ingredients to actually manage conflict when it comes about, whether it be in the front line or on the policy side. What would your advice be?
Yeah, I think that's like such like the most important question in this is like, how do we create, like I said, an environment that is one that we can have these conversations with trust? Because it does, like when we took a pause, what we're encouraging you to do at the end is to think about like those moments where actually there is a bit of conflict and defensiveness sometimes that comes up, and it almost is inherent with these discussions. Like we need to create a space where we can actually feel into them and name them. And I think that's actually how you build trust, is like, I've come to Trish and said, like, I've fallen over my feet, you know, in this, you know, using that metaphor many times, and said, you know, this just like, I said this thing and don't know if it landed well, but to lead with a sense of vulnerability, like when you're not meant to be this, like none of us are experts other than, you know, an expert of your own kind of sense of making sense, if that Makes sense. But that's certainly my takeaway, is like to really lead with a sense of vulnerability. And certainly I think, like, you know, in our team, that's what I've tried to offer. And I encourage you all to kind of go with the same thing. If this doesn't feel comfortable, or this is what came up for me, I'm just like, I'm not sure, could we do better? Like, to come from a really curious place, I think really does help.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the other things I would add too that I've witnessed on our team is that when people come to say they just want to meet us, you know, they just want to come and have some tea and, like, you know, meet without an ask, or, you know, when they're coming to us with a reciprocity. So, you know, instead of like, oh, we want, you know, you to be on this committee, or we want you to be on this review, or we want you to, you know, do this, thinking about, like, do you have a existing relationship already with the team, or that person that you're asking that particular ask from? And then when you're coming to that team, thinking about, in your sphere of influence, what you can do from there, and seeing how that relationship can be reciprocal.
Yeah, just to build on what Darci said, I think this building that relationship, you would be amazed at how far a free coffee goes, or a free muffin, and, you know, and build that invite, and build that relationship. And it takes time. Like, it doesn't happen overnight, but I think ultimately, like, just having that initial introduction to each other, what's your end game, and how can we get there together, and really just building that relationship is so key.
It's just, the thought just came to my mind that it's like hard to be vulnerable around like a board table in a way too. So it's like that relationship's so important, because like in the casual, around the kitchen table, in the more casual interaction, that's where like vulnerability becomes safe, more so than like at developing policy around the boardroom. Or
And that's where we talked quickly just about like the semantics of kitchen table versus like the like board table as an example. That's just what sparked me, because we talked about this as a group, of like recognizing like how we structure some of our meetings doesn't necessarily invite vulnerability into the room. So being really careful about the name in which we go for like what we're discussing, and thinking about the ways that it promotes inclusivity, that it promotes an ability to show up as your whole self. So that's what resonates for me around a kitchen table, is that we all have our own vision of what that is, but that it does invite you to have, you know, a conversation where you can bring your whole self, that you can be doing something during, you know, like sharing a meal together or otherwise, but you're actually like, you know, able to kind of engage together in a way that feels like everyone's an equal player. So semantics also like really do matter in how we bring vulnerability into our work.
I want to thank all of you for being here and sharing this with us. I think you've given us a lot to think about. It's certainly an area that we need to hear more about, and I think we are all learning in little steps. So I think that draws the conclusion our morning, and there's not a kitchen table, but there is food out there. So thank you very much.